In today's video, we're going to look at how to paint a sick fabric texture effect with a surprisingly simple technique. We'll start off with a dark reddy brown colour by mixing a bit of scale colour red leather into some brown leather. And we'll thin that down with some water so it flows off the brush and doesn't obscure any details. Paint that onto your model over a couple of layers until you get a nice even coverage. Instead of blocking highlights in then blending them out with texturing, our strategy here is going to involve building up our highlights using texturing and only texturing, which is actually a much faster process, and because it's less technical, it tends to be easier to execute. So once you've got the base coat down, the first highlight is made by mixing a bit of the original flesh colour into the brown. And I use Tallarn Flesh for that, but you can use whatever paint you used on the skin of your model. Now the idea is to paint this on using overlapping horizontal lines, just painting them onto all the areas where you want to build up a highlight. I'll mostly show this on the back of the legs, but it's just the same thing on the front really. At this initial stage, you want to cover up most of the surface with the lines, with the idea being that you'll gradually refine them as you build up the colour of the highlights. Like most things in miniature painting, you want to start off with quite a broad, almost ham-fisted approach, then gradually get smaller and more careful as your colour gets more intense. Apply these over a couple of layers, especially if you're using scale colour. Scale colour is highly transparent. Generally, you need to apply a few layers to get decent coverage. If you've seen my pig bust video where I did the leather, this is a similar sort of idea, but it's much more simple. And also, we're not painting leather here, but the general idea of stacking layers of texture on top of each other is basically the same. So if you enjoy this approach and you feel that you want to attempt a more fleshed out method to get a bit more of a complex effect, definitely check out that video. For the next highlight, we're going to add a bit more of the flesh colour into the mix and we'll keep adding our lines. This time focusing more on the areas where we want our highlights to be more pronounced. So along the back of the thighs, the top of the calf muscles and the back of the ankles. The tighter you make your lines, the more solid the colour will appear. So make your lines tight where you want the strongest colour and then allow them to spread out slightly as you move away from that point. Careful not to make these lines too large or too thick because you'll spoil the effect, so use a good brush with a fine tip. Be gentle and don't apply pressure on the bristles. That'll ensure you get nice, clean, sharp brush strokes. Being able to control the pressure you exert on the brush while you're painting is a fundamental skill. It's not often brought up in miniature painting tutorials, but pressure is very important. Easing up on the brush and being more gentle will allow you to leave less paint on the surface. Thus, you can control the transparency somewhat by simply altering how much pressure you apply. In short, more pressure means more paint. Note here that you can paint the texture lines on with either fairly thick or thin paint. Thin paint is going to require more layers to cover the surface, and thus it's going to take longer to do. But it generally gives you more control and tends to be a bit easier to get a more refined result, as it's a lot easier to control the transparency of the lines. On the other hand, thicker paint will allow you to create the effect a lot faster, but it will be slightly harder to do as it requires more nuanced brush control. If you're using a thicker consistency, you'll need to take more care about the amount of pressure that you're using on the brush. So by adopting a lighter touch, you'll be able to have less paint on the surface, and in that way you have more control over the coverage. Add a bit more Tallarn Flesh and we'll keep going with the texturing. Here I'm trying to make the lines a bit shorter than the previous layer so that we create a transition. If you make your lines all the same size, you'll just cover up your last highlight and end up with a single colour. A nice way to approach this is to lay down a row of lines, leaving them all slightly spaced out. Then go back in for another pass and fill in some of the gaps in the areas where you want to create the strongest highlight. And that's what I'm doing here. Notice the way that I'm essentially painting over the texture on the top of the calf, filling in some of the gaps. That's because I want the highlight at the top of the calf to be stronger, so I simply add more of the paint in that area. Notice we're starting to get quite a nice texturing effect coming through after only a few layers of highlight. You can spend as much time refining this as you like. Doing it fairly quickly will still get you a pretty decent effect for tabletop. It's really up to you how much effort you want to put into it. Mix some more Talar flesh into the highlight and we'll keep going, doing essentially the same thing, this time making our lines a bit more refined than in the previous step. Each time you add more of the flesh colour into the highlight, you want to reduce the size of your line slightly so that you're covering a smaller surface area. That way you create a layering effect where you can still see the texture from all the previous highlights so that you get a gradual increase in the intensity of the colour. You can see that we're starting to build up quite a nice effect now, and that's all just with lines, so there's really no fancy wet blending or fiddly glazing. We're just layering lines on top of more lines. When you're layering normally, it's quite easy for the eye to see where one layer ends and the next one begins. But when you're layering with texture like this, it's much harder to notice these steps between each colour because your eyes have a lot more to look at. It might look a bit rough zoomed in like this, but remember that the model is actually pretty small, so when you're viewing it in context, it will look a lot more subtle than it actually is. If you're painting with any kind of magnification, don't forget to stop occasionally and look at the model normally so that you get an idea of what it actually looks like. There's a tendency to get tunnel vision and really zone out when you're focusing on one little area, so it's good to take a step back and assess how you're doing from time to time. Here you can see on the front it's exactly the same process, just painting horizontal lines where we want to build up the highlights. For the last highlight, we're going to mix in a bit of the highlight colour we used on the flesh. For that I used some Vallejo Sunny Skin Tone mixed with some Vallejo Ivory to get a very light orangey yellow, and I simply mixed a bit of that into the highlight colour to lighten it. This was painted on in exactly the same way using our little horizontal lines. You can see that we're using quite small controlled lines for this, especially when you compare them to the ones we used in our initial highlight. This whole process is actually a good way to approach painting in general. You want to start off with quite broad strokes, then gradually refine things as you build up the colour and detail. And we'll do the same on the back, painting on those small refined strokes onto the brightest parts of the highlights. I'm being quite gentle with the brush here to ensure that I'm using the very tip of the bristles. That way we're going to keep our lines thin and controlled. So make sure you're using a good brush for this. If you're interested in the one that I'm using, there's a link in the description below if you want to pick one up. If you've never tried this sort of technique where you're layering texture on top of texture, absolutely give it a go. It's a lot less fiddly than trying to get perfectly smooth blends. You can obviously spend even more time on it and refine it further with more lines. It just depends how much time that you want to invest in it, and that's totally up to you. If you're new to the channel, subscribe so you don't miss an upload. Give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment to let me know what you thought. Okay, I'm going now. Bye.